What moved me so much is that I went out that evening on June 5th, having made the weather decision, and looked each of those guys in the eyes and talked about home, talked about sports scores, talked about fly fishing, talked about all of the things that those kids remembered so well from home, and basically reminded them of what they had to live for, because they were all scared to death, those kids. And it takes a lot of guts to do that, actually, to look in the eyes of, the people who are going to be subject to the decisions you're making.
That's Susan Eisenhower, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show where we use the lenses of risk and uncertainty to understand ourselves and our world a little bit better. Now, as you might have guessed or inferred, I've been wanting to have an episode in which we take a big picture look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, there is just so much analysis out there about the conflict that I wasn't sure if I could bring on the right guest who would be both highly credible and could offer a perspective that's unique and also steeped in a wider historical context. Well, I'm delighted today to bring to you my conversation with Susan Eisenhower. Susan is the granddaughter of General and the 34th President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. Susan researched and wrote a critically acclaimed book about her grandfather's leadership principles entitled How Ike Led. Ike, of course, was how General and President Eisenhower was also known. Susan Eisenhower is also an expert on relations between Russia and the United States and on international security, space policy, and energy. She is the chair emeritus and chair of public policy programs of the Eisenhower Institute. In 2010, she served on the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future, and she also served on a variety of other government task forces. She advises governments and companies as the founder of the Eisenhower Group, a consulting firm, amongst many other things. So suffice it to say, she knows of what she speaks. Now, this conversation proceeds in two parts. In the first half, Susan covers General and President Dwight Eisenhower's leadership principles, particularly how he made decisions with a focus on D-Day and how he made the decision to land on Normandy on June 6th, 1944. She also discusses the Solarium project, which was something President Eisenhower led when, as president, his government looked at options to deal with Soviet expansionism. All of this is not only fascinating, but these leadership and decision-making principles are highly transferable to other contexts. In the second half of the episode, we fast forward to the present and we talk about Russia's war with Ukraine. Susan shares insights on how we got here, a number of concerns she has, as well as the longer-term implications of the crisis. She also shares insights into the nuclear dimension of the conflict and around decision-making in the context of nuclear war more broadly. And we do end on a positive note. So let's dive in. Here is Susan Eisenhower. Susan, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thanks, Ben. I'm delighted to be here.
You have obviously a famous grandfather, and we'll talk about him. You're also a consultant and a policy analyst in your own right. It might be useful first, before we dive into some of the topics we'd like to cover, for you to just give a little bit of a background to your work and how you also got into researching and writing about your grandfather.
Well, thanks, Ben. As I say, it's a delight to be on your program. And a question like that is always one of those nerve-wracking questions. After a long career, you wonder what things to highlight. But I had a rather circuitous route to the kind of work I'm doing today. I started my career as a journalist, and then the deadlines came at all the wrong hours, and I ended up going into corporate strategic marketing. And it was through that lens that I was given the opportunity to create a vision for the Eisenhower Institute, which was founded by my grandfather's associates. And in that context, a new leader was coming to power in the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. And I put together a program as a corporate strategic marketing person that I thought would be great for the Eisenhower Institute. And in that year of 1986, we put together the first open policy debate and forum in Soviet history. And we brought American policymakers together with Soviet policymakers. And once I became visible in that process, I kept being invited to important forums and the rest of it on U.S.-Soviet issues. And so suddenly I was in the middle of the foreign policy field. I'd like to think because of my background as a journalist, I never stopped asking the hard questions about why are we doing what we're doing and why does this make any sense? And again, what are the risks in taking this path or that path? But anyway, that's how I got into the field. I never, though, really put aside the business community. And today, since 1986, I've been running a small consulting company that helps companies develop sustainable strategies as opposed to short-term strategies. I'm a long-range thinker, probably much like my grandfather. So now, having said all that, how is it that I end up writing 2 books about the Eisenhower family? That was certainly never me. I wrote 5 or 6 books altogether, and some of them were on NATO, and some of them were on Central Asia, and some of them were on the building of the International Space Station, but 2 of them happened to be about the Eisenhower family. The first one was called Mrs. Ike. This was a book about my grandmother, Mamie Eisenhower, and she had kind of a reputation those days of being the quintessential housewife and a bit of a charming matron for her time. She was actually a piece of work, and she was a terrific lady, and she played a huge role in lightening up her husband and making sure he had fun and helping him manage his stress. But she was a very strong, very decisive person. And I thought, well, this is a great relief from watching the Soviet Union collapse. At some point, I decided to screech on the brakes and took 6 months to write that. And then 25 years later, literally, I wrote How Ike Led, the principles behind Eisenhower's biggest decisions.
So there's tons here we can dive into, but one of the things that I just want to get your take on, and that's just around, I guess, just history and whether or not, and I'm fairly certain where you're going to land on this, but do individuals and moments matter? And if so, how? Versus these are all structures and forces are just moving the world into a certain direction, and it kind of doesn't matter who's in charge.
Well, Ben, that is really the great leadership question. I do a certain amount of leadership consulting, and especially in the last 10 years, which is one of the reasons I decided to write this book, because Eisenhower's brand of leadership is not as well understood as it should be. He did a lot behind the scenes. He was highly disciplined about what he said in public. He exercised restraint as a matter of principle. And so, as you can see, especially if you look around today, this is kind of an unusual set of attributes. In any case, the leadership industry has been struggling with this question since time immemorial, even before it became an industry. It was the great man theory of leadership, and now we have everybody can be a leader approach. I personally think that a person can make an enormous difference. I don't know, in a way, how I could think otherwise. Now, actually, Ben, before we get too much farther into this conversation, I want you to know that as a member of the Eisenhower family, one of Ike's 4 grandchildren, we were raised to be completely compartmentalized on the subject of our grandfather. So if I ever mention him granddad in this interview, then I've got my family hat on. If he's President or General Eisenhower, I'm thinking about him as an analyst. So certainly as a writer and an analyst, I had to really examine his career. I learned a lot. And then occasionally I would take off one hat and put on the other and say, wow, he was doing that while we were, at the farm visiting him over Thanksgiving or something like that. But he really made a difference. President and General Eisenhower really made a difference. He was the right man at exactly the right time in Europe. This war was a war that is so monumental that we have a little bit of a tendency to romanticize it now. But the allies, our allies, Western allies, had a lot more potential to be divided and working at cross purposes than it turned out we were. And that was largely because of General Eisenhower's capacity to bring people together, to be fair, to be reasonable, respectful, I would even say kind, and at the same time making big strategic decisions and overriding, by the way, in some cases, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and even his president, because they put him in charge of that military operation. And I can give you two examples if you're interested. Of
Absolutely.
Where actually overrode. Okay, well, after D-Day, there was always the agreement that the Allies were going to then invade southern France as a way to augment forces in Normandy. And Prime Minister Churchill absolutely did not want this Operation Anvil to go forward. As a matter of fact, he renamed it Operation Dragoon because he felt like he'd been dragooned into the decision. In any case, Eisenhower said, if this is a political objection you have to this invasion, please take it up with President Roosevelt. Otherwise, we're going forward. And we did go forward. That was a very successful operation in the South that augmented American forces just to the north. So that's one example. On overriding President Roosevelt, it was actually a pretty cool move, I have to say, because President Roosevelt had no time for or interest in promoting the career of General Charles de Gaulle. And General Eisenhower just thought, wow, we don't want to go into Paris or be responsible for what goes on in Paris, but we have to, take that region, but we have to keep fighting to get to our objective. And the only way Eisenhower thought he could do that was to actually give support to Charles de Gaulle. And this is the reason Eisenhower, I think, managed his ego brilliantly and allowing, from an optics point of view, the French to liberate their own city, even though they were playing a relatively minor role in all of this. And so in one of the most exciting case of strategic optics was when Eisenhower allows the French to go first and then follows it up with American divisions who marched down the Champs-Élysées to show support for the French, and that would be General de Gaulle, and then continued marching right out the backside of Paris into combat in the afternoon. But the French all thought the Americans were staying. What they didn't know is that those divisions went straight through Paris and on to combat later in the day. It was a brilliant way of, securing Paris without being every day responsible for what went on in that city.
So much interesting stuff. This is fascinating.
Well, I think President Roosevelt was a little bit surprised, but I don't know whether he was surprised or not, but this was certainly never his scenario. And, if you're given that kind of responsibility, then I don't know if you've ever seen what his job description looked like. You want to talk about risk-taking. Oh, it was basically, there were a few small details, but it was basically invade the mainland of Europe and secure victory. And the rest is up to you.
Can we dive into that decision a little bit more and what Operation Overlord, what the decision making, you described it so well in the book. And there are a number of principles that seem to come through that I would like to spend a little bit of time on. Perhaps we could just start, if you could maybe just give an overview of how General Eisenhower made that decision of when to invade, how to do that, how he got various perspectives, how he checked his own, as you say, his own ego.
Well, the checking of the own ego is a very, very important thing. A lot of people think that it's reassuring for others to show bluster and look like a big, tough guy. Let me tell you, he could be tough. He could be tough. He was as tough as he ever had to be. But, if you ever lose your heart in the process, you can win supporters for a certain period of time. But after a while, they fade off or they lose respect or something happens. And I was always surprised at how much the people who worked for him stayed with him his whole life. Anyway, getting to D-Day, it's a really interesting thing in how he tries to win the support of the organizers of the plan, because, of course, planning work for D-Day had been underway for some while. First of all, I should say quickly for your listeners that it was a surprise that Eisenhower got the command of D-Day. It was expected, since it was the most important moment for our Allied cause, that General Marshall, George Marshall, who was Chief of Staff of the Army and architect, basically, of the Allied response to World War II, at least the United States response, everybody thought that he would be given that command because he kind of, quote unquote, deserved it, and it was something he probably wanted, though he never said. But President Roosevelt just decided that there was too much risk in it, that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. General Marshall was in Washington. He had outstanding relations with Congress, pretty much. But more important, he had an outstanding relationship with President Roosevelt. So the idea of sending George Marshall off and bringing Eisenhower back just seemed like something that was not necessary because Eisenhower had already been a success in Europe. Also, Dwight Eisenhower got along with Winston Churchill better than George Marshall did. And everybody recognized the indispensable role that the British Prime Minister was playing. And so it was decided, Roosevelt decided to keep Eisenhower on for D-Day. Eisenhower looks at the plans for D-Day and says, no, wait a minute, we've only got 3 beaches here and certain amount of force, and it's not nearly enough. And if we're not going to enlarge this, I've got real problems with taking on this job. So what he does is he calls in the highest ranking British military officer, General Montgomery, and wins Montgomery over to his cause, and then dispatches Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Smith, and General Montgomery off to soften up the ground in Britain for a larger invasion force. Now, the only reason I'm telling you this is that his principle in assuming risk was to make sure that you were not skimping on resources. Because the minute you do that, if you endanger the first part of any critical enterprise, then everything else is called into question. So he gets his 2 extra beaches. One is a broader beach for Omaha Beach, and the second is the creation of Utah Beach, which would make it possible for American forces to meet their objectives in Cherbourg. In any case, then the next 2 big things are the paratroop drop, which was opposed by Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory at the end because he felt that it was too risky. The Germans had just moved a division into the region, and these airborne troops were going to be dropping probably not that far from German divisions. And Eisenhower had the agonizing moment of having to give his technical advisor an answer about whether or not those paratroopers would be used. And Eisenhower decided after some thought that after running through, by the way, all of the strategic objectives and the various elements of it, he decided the airborne troops, despite a prediction of losing between 50 and 70% of them, decided we had to go ahead. That's probably the riskiest moment of the 20th century, because had we failed in Normandy, the history of the world would have been different. So he lets Trafford Lee Mallory know that he respected his recommendation, but wanted to be sure that Lee Mallory went out to, try and prepare the troops for what he called a tough job.
Right.
And then that night, and Ben, sorry for going into this story so much, but it's moving for me. That night, he, on June 5th, after he made one of the most perilous weather decisions, it was pouring, it was raining, and they were in terrible set of conditions when the weather team suggested there might be an opening in the weather. Now, remember, again, back to risk management, and paratroopers have to have good weather conditions in order to drop, because they have to be able to more or less see their targets. But they were told that there was going to be this opening in the weather, and Eisenhower decided that they'd go because the risk denigrating or eroding morale among the troops, and the risk that the Germans might find out we're going, would be too great. In fact, the weather, being as dubious as it was, actually played into our hands because the Germans didn't think we would take the risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the paratroopers got dropped. They did a heroic job. Instead of losing 50 to 70%, the losses were more between 5 and 10 on that day. But I was starting to say what moved me so much is that I went out that evening on June 5th, having made the weather decision, and looked each of those guys in the eyes and talked about home, talked about sports scores, talked about fly fishing, talked about all of the things that those kids remembered so well from home, and basically reminded them of what they had to live for, because they were all scared to death, those kids. And it takes a lot of guts to do that, actually, to look in the eyes of, the people who are going to be subject to the decisions you're making.
I think that that's such an important lesson for leaders of all kinds, that having a sense of purpose and a direction is vitally important to get any kind of buy-in for anything. And that moved me as well. I wrote that quote down. He wanted to remind them of what they had to live for. I really love that quote.
Well, the other thing I have to say, Ben, a granddad, so I got my family hat on here, really believed in accountability. Oh my God, did we ever get lectures about, not lectures, he never lectured, but now you have to take responsibility for this. And if you understand that you're going to take responsibility for all of your decisions, then you're going to be smart about how you make those decisions in the first place. There is no one there to blame for you. Haha. Okay, that comes out of good Army schooling, right? It's called No Excuses, Sir. But I think it's also moving that on June 5th, just before he goes out to meet the paratroopers, he writes a note to be released in case of failure. And in it, he says that if there is any failure in this operation, the blame is mine and mine alone. And he was going to release that to the press had they failed in Normandy. I just think it's a really important thing, because the thing, if I could just be so direct, drives me nuts is how many of our political and corporate leaders today are always finding some excuse, like, oh, it was COVID, or oh, it was this, or oh, it was that, or my political opponent, you can finish the sentence. And actually, it's all dependent on the decisions they make. And I think that was probably the strongest piece of advice I got as a kid, is don't be looking for people. It starts right where you are.
Yeah, that certainly comes through in the book, and the values and the sort of sense of responsibility and sense of duty. The other thing that really was a thread that seemed to carry throughout his presidency is getting a diversity of opinions and getting all of the facts. And even when he spoke, he would start with, here are the facts, right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's a lot of scholarship written about World War II, and there were a lot of disagreements among the Allies. And occasionally you'll read scholars saying, poor Eisenhower, he had so much to deal with, and blah, blah, blah. And it was a tough job. It was a tough job because any top general has to make decisions with an inadequate amount of information. you never have a full understanding or a full level of intelligence about what the enemy is doing by definition, because it's war. There's a fog of war, but there's also a lag in what you know and what you don't know. So that's a tough thing to make decisions under those circumstances. But it's not just about for intelligence gathering. But I realized that actually he didn't feel sorry for himself in managing a diverse and raucous group during the war, because when he got to be president, he put his cabinet together in exactly the same way. And as a matter of fact, his chief of staff, New Hampshire Governor Sherman Adams, was very much the same personality as General Walter Bedell Smith as chief of staff during the war. Irascible, opinionated, this and that. And Ike loved the pushback because he thought it helped him clarify his own thinking. And what it would do would be to present some perspectives that he might not have thought of, which then gives greater depth to the context of any decision he was about to make.
Could we fast forward here then? Because you also describe when he was president, I think it's called Project Solarium, the options to evaluate Soviet expansionism or Soviet aggression. And I loved the way he tackled that. And maybe if you could just describe how he did that.
Well, first of all, again, and the larger point here has been, I wanted to make sure that readers understood that when they elected Dwight Eisenhower, not only was he at that time a registered independent who became a Republican, but that he was also General Eisenhower, and that he put aside his military commission to run for president. But the point is, he thought like a military man. And so I think, that's important when you think about how he made some of these decisions. Which one did you think was most compelling?
When he looked at options for Soviet...
Well, the Solarium Project, the Solarium Project really comes out of the way he would have managed some parts of the war, which is that we've got three different strategic choices here. And I want to hear everybody's views about them, because I'm going to make a decision and then you will have had your time to say your piece. And I think that political leaders today don't understand the value of giving everybody a full hearing, because then what they do is that they can always say, we settled that issue. And so Solarium basically was an exercise that went on for a number of months. This was just after Joseph Stalin's death. And the idea was America going to take a position of rollback, to try and roll back the gains of the Soviet Union after the war? Was our objective going to be containment, which was already adopted to some degree? Or was our objective going to be some hybrid between the two? In any case, they chose kind of a hybrid, but it was largely based on containment. But then there were a number of other ancillary decisions that went with that decision coming out of Solarium. But he put the best brains. Not only did he put the best brains on this project, but he put people from the previous administration, from the current administration, from people who might be in future administrations, cabinet members, Secretary of Treasury even sat on this thing. And they listened to the staff work and the rest of these decisions. George Kennan, as a matter of fact, spoke for containment, and a number of other leading people spoke for the other options. Then the President of the United States was able to make a decision, and that was it. They spoke with one voice after that administration did, and that was it. And to make sure they did, Eisenhower put an implementer into the White House process that went around and made sure that every time the president made a decision, literally everybody was following that decision. Again, this has there's a little reminiscence to the way the war was handled, even though we're in an entirely civilian world. But it's, instead of viewing organization, it's utilizing organization to create both unity and also compliance with the president's decision. Could I say one more thing, Ben?
Absolutely.
I just had this amazing thought the other day. Occasionally, this is strategy analyst Susan speaking about General and President Eisenhower, but he managed to do something that really just popped into my head the other day. He managed to unify our country in peacetime. Almost, if you think about it, almost the great moments of unity in this country are when we're at war, but not when we're at peace. Can you imagine how profound that is, that America could be unified in peacetime? And part of that is the seriousness with which he took the challenge from the Soviet Union. And he saw domestic unity as critical to our national security. So he said that disunity, deep divisions in the United States are, this is his quote, a welcome sight to an alert enemy, end quote. He put unifying this country in peacetime right there at the top of the list, including, by the way, doing everything he could to preserve the peace.
And that seems like such a distant thing now.
It does. It does. It makes me a little sad, to be perfectly honest. But he said that it's not enough to say that you have peaceful intentions. You have to, what did he say? You have to nail it to a banner for all to see. And that means that your actions have to follow. If peace is your objective, then, you have to find ways and methods to assure the world that that's really what your objective is. But again, he was a great strategist, even though we didn't understand how, from a leadership perspective, he made some of these things happen.
Well, I think there are a number of transferable principles, right? The fact that he was this general and then the president and applied some of the same principles just make it a lot clearer that these principles can be transferred to many a context.
Well, okay, so my chapter on civil rights I call establishing a beachhead, which is actually a military term. But how many people are in an office like the presidency and say integration of our schools and public places and the things that the government organizes, and that integration is a good thing, and then look at the way he did it. What he did it the way he invaded Normandy. He established a beachhead, and how did he do that during his presidency? He did it by using everything at the federal government's power to do. That's establishing a beachhead, because the executive office, the executive branch of our government, manages the federal government. So there were all kinds of things he could do, including desegregating Washington, D.C. schools, even before the Supreme Court had ruled Brown versus Board of Education. Why? Because the federal government controls and runs Washington, D.C., or at least has oversight for it, as it does today. Anyway, my point is that you establish a beachhead, you understand where the real estate your opposition occupies, you make sure that you can make inroads into that real estate without a frontal attack, because there are faster ways to meet your objectives. Anyway, that's what I loved about writing the book, was just seeing how maybe his military training might apply to a domestic issue of great sensitivity like civil rights.
That's another great example. I would like to fast forward to the present and the situation with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. And I'd like to maybe hypothesize a little bit around what principles you'd like to see policymakers take given what's going on. But before that, maybe we could talk a little bit about, I'd love to get your views around how we somehow got here, how the world got here.
Well, I think that, first of all, the collapse of the Soviet Union was such a surprise for Western governments, especially, that I don't think we were well prepared to think through what we were going to do. Now, this may shock and surprise your listeners, but this is a fact, that the United States supported the maintenance of the Soviet Union, did not support the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, you can go back and look at George H.W. Bush's speech in Kiev, as a matter of fact, suggesting, or not more than suggesting, urging the Ukrainians to remain part of the Soviet Union. Now, why was that? That sounds, in the context of today, that sounds shocking. But we felt that a failed nation of that size, with that level of nuclear capability, could be not only a threat to the United States, but the entire world. And so when the Soviet Union did collapse, and then I'd like to also remind your listeners that the Soviet Union collapsed because, the 15 so-called republics within the Soviet Union all had a different view on the shaky political situation in the Soviet Union. It was Russia's Boris Yeltsin and the Belarusian president and the Ukrainian president. The three of them went into the woods in Belarus and signed the Soviet Union out of business. And so look at that now. I mean, these three countries are now sovereign countries, are the ones in the middle of this conflict. And so it's very interesting. Literally, the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, was sitting in his office in the Kremlin with nobody, none of his staff members there. He was there, like a lone individual all the way up until the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin in December of 1991. So I think all of that was such a surprise to the West that we didn't do any long-term planning. So I think one of the principles is, and I'm such a fan of your podcast because I love the idea of risk myself. I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I spent 27 years of my career going to Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic republics, Central Asia. I wrote two books on Central Asia, and I know that region well. And I think genetically I may have inherited some of my grandfather's long-term skills. I'm a better long-term planner than I am a short-term planner, I'll tell you that. That's not bragging. That's just a fact, and it's a disadvantage sometimes. But what's happening today, really regrettably, it was predicted 20 years ago. It was even, pretty much in certain circles predicted 10 years ago. And it makes me very sad, that's all I can say, that we couldn't find a solution to this before this destruction occurred, because the destruction is almost complete. It's not only is Ukraine, I mean, it's horrific to watch this. It's terrible that the Russians did this. It hurts all of us to watch these people suffering. But the damage extends into Russia as well. The democratic movement there is now being shut down. I heard today that two people I know really very well have been fired from a committee, and I don't know what their fate is. And all of us know people who are probably either been sent into exile, these are Russians, or sent to the Gulag. Okay, so we've got victims everywhere. We've got victims of direct aggression, and then we've got victims of a terrible crackdown inside of Russia. It's going to hurt me personally a lot to see an agreement between Russia and Ukraine that's going to look like an agreement we could have negotiated 25 years ago. Because what this was is a failure of everybody, to think like contingency planners. I'm an obsessive contingency planner. To fail to see, as my grandfather would say, these as human problems. And he used to talk about human problems all the time. I don't remember that myself, so I should say President Eisenhower and General Eisenhower talked about human problems. It's time that we looked at human problems in a human way to understand the psychology. He started the psychology department at West Point because he felt that there needed to be something more than just a technical view of what they do. And then also my final thought on this, Ben, is that we missed a big window of opportunity to secure a kind of future for that part of the world that would make it so people didn't have to make the hideous choices that they've ended up having to make. And I'm talking about the choice that Ukraine's going to have to make here. It's heartbreaking, but I have to say that it was predictable. And that makes me feel like all of us, that means all of us, literally, not just the United States, but all of us have failed in some way. Failed Ukraine and failed a lot of countries in that region, including, by the way, the early opportunities we had after the collapse of the Soviet Union to secure a future for Russia as well in the western part of the country.
Okay, I would like to maybe talk a bit about Vladimir Putin and his decision to invade. And actually, what the image I have in my mind is that meeting he had with all of his advisors, and they all sort of got up and supported the invasion, basically, and how that contrasts to what your grandfather maybe would have done. But could we talk a little bit about what Vladimir Putin's choices seem to be now?
Well, again, we're in that zone where we have one kind of knowledge but not another kind. So we can actually put facts and figures to the casualties and the equipment and where troops and material are located. We can do all that, but what we can't do is get inside of somebody else's head. And if I may say so, Ben, one of the really alarming things about this crisis for me is that over the last, since 2014, we have been slowly withdrawing all of our personnel from these respective embassies. There are just a handful of people in the embassy in Moscow, and there are a handful of people in the embassy in Washington, the Russian embassy. And now, why is that important? Because there is a nuclear dimension to this. And when people talk about this being analogous to World War II, I'm afraid I don't buy it. There are lots of, important things that are different about this crisis. One of them is the clear and evident presence of the nuclear issue. And so to have nobody in your embassies, to have all relationships cut off is a danger because we can't calibrate the other side. Now, one of the most worrying things about nuclear weapons, they're sort of kept around because they have for decades, 75 years, kind of quote unquote kept the peace. It's a pretty scary peace, but it's kept it. But there's always the concern about miscalculation. And I think what's really interesting about studying the Cuban Missile Crisis is how the Kennedy administration assumed that even boarding Soviet ships headed for Cuba with possibly components for nuclear weapons was enough to turn this into a nuclear war with little or no in-between time. And at that time, even Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, was sent off to talk to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. I mean, they fanned out. There were endless numbers of contacts that were underway. Khrushchev and Kennedy were writing letters to each other, very respectful letters, by the way. And they were trying to feel each other out. But today we don't have that infrastructure, that connection infrastructure.
Wow.
So what has been scaring people like me who spend time in the arms control community and the rest of it is that something might happen that could be misinterpreted. And the environment is so toxic. It was scary during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was not disrespectful. I'm talking about on both sides, right? And today, I would say that without passing any judgment, trust me on this, but the choice has been to personalize this fight. And in doing so, however, that does compromise the capacity of both of our sides to communicate around some really critical things. If I could add one more thing to this, yes, they do have a deconfliction committee at the Department of Defense, but it's way lower order. It has to do with just making sure that on a tactical basis, something doesn't happen. But what I'm talking about here are strategic miscalculations. And for those who don't know that much about arms control, or I should say the nuclear issue, there were several times during the Cold War and even after the Cold War where we came within minutes of being having our planet blown up.
Wow. That's a very sobering thought.
Yeah, there was a case in 1985. The Soviet Union didn't have their early warning systems where it collapsed because they ended up in what were now foreign countries that had once been part of the Soviet Union. And there was something that looked like an incoming missile to the people who were monitoring the situation. And it was really only because one person somewhere in that chain of command decided that they just weren't going to take the chance and recommend that, President Yeltsin push the button. It turned out to be a Norwegian scientific satellite.
Wow.
At risk, especially combined with cyber warfare and cyber hackers, is even greater today than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis or even in 1980. It was 95, not 85.
Could we talk about this in just a little bit more detail? Because in a circumstance like that, there's very little time to get the facts. There's very little time to discern what is actually going on. And so unless there are some structures in place to quickly discern those facts, the chances of miscalculation just goes up extraordinarily so.
I don't think that anybody is going to sit down and say, I've had enough, I'm gonna nuke the US.
Sure.
But again, with the cyber dimension, the capacity to make something look different than it really is general practice now in the whole cyber sphere. And then you add to that, and I'm really not sure about this, Ben. I would need to go back and really do some research so that I'm confident in saying it. But I have had some experts tell me that the Russian early warning system is still not fully functional, which means to say that they don't have 360-degree situational awareness, which means miscalculation is greater on their part, perhaps, than on the U.S. side, because we do have a system that has been unaffected by changes over the last 30 years, and we've probably kept ours modern. I just don't know how to evaluate that, but I do remember when that analysis was done a number of years ago, and it was a source of enormous concern, really. So we need to reestablish these contacts, and what I think, if there's any real principle involved here, is that whenever people get cornered, it makes everything more dangerous. And in an interesting sort of way, President Biden's a bit cornered too. He's kind of cornered himself by making assertions that I have no quarrel with, in essence, but making them in such a way that it would be impossible for the United States to really be negotiating with President Putin, unless there is an outstanding communications job that makes the case to the American people that this is now absolutely critical for North American security or for the security of the world. But he'd have to take that step. He'd have to do a John Kennedy speech to the American people type thing, where he would explain why he found it necessary to negotiate with the war criminal, which is what he's called President Putin. So, I think in all risk calculations, always leaving some room to maneuver for both sides is critical, because that's what you want to have happen. You want to get out of a certain situation into a better set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about the peace that hopefully eventually gets negotiated between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And I don't know what that looks like, other than it seems to me almost inevitable that the Ukrainians are going to have to give up some territory. And that means that potentially the agreement, like longer term, is unstable. And that creates a short-term or longer-term problem. Maybe I would love to get your perspectives on this kind of maybe medium, longer-term implications of this conflict.
Well, it seems to me that the tragedy was that we couldn't find a way to, if we'd gotten at this sooner, it would have been a lot easier. This agreement is going to be harder and probably more exacting on both sides. But listen, I think that Ukraine deserves, if it moves into the neutrality area, it deserves to have everybody's support in assuring that there is no sacrifice involved with that. In other words, Finland had a very prosperous, important role to play during the last Cold War and has been a prosperous country in the post-Cold War period. I should say Cold War I, maybe. Periods, we don't get confused about these things. And I think that we have to, make an article of faith that we do right by Ukraine in terms of economic development and all of the other things that go with that. And, if relations weren't so bad between our president and the Russian president, we could exact their promises on a verifiable basis as well. I would say that I think regime change, that was a mistake on the part of our president to even hint at that. And I understand the impulse to want to speak from the heart and speak to our allies and the American public, but we're in the middle of a strategic game right now. And I hate to use the word game. And in that, the notion of restraint and keeping your views to yourself is every bit as strategically important as making the right moves, correct? So again, we're going to have a hard time convincing the Russians that regime change is not our objective. And then that makes it harder to do right by Ukraine in terms of mutual security assurances and the rest of it. I don't know. I mean, on reflection, I worked very, very hard, Ben, for 27 years of trying to make the post-Soviet space safer for the world. Mm-hmm. I was very, very fortunate to serve on a number of commissions for the Department of Energy. I worked on securing nuclear materials inside the Russian Federation. I worked on a working group with Russia's top nuclear scientists to help them make the transition, into the post-Soviet space. I worked long and hard on all kinds of, issues related to space cooperation and other things. And there's a lot of damage that's been done. Putin's going to have to take responsibility for it, that invasion. But the thing that we're going to have to take responsibility for is not thinking long enough term. In other words, being only short-sighted in the challenges that we were facing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if I may say, it's not just about Russia. It's about the entire former Soviet space. We're not very good listeners. We would be well advised to do a lot of listening now as we come into this new phase, because we have a rising China. We have still a fairly turbulent Middle East. And even if they reach a short-term compromise, to your point, this is going to be a long, painful process. And it's going to require some special things from all of us, really all of us.
You've been involved in cooperation on things like space and a variety of technical things. And actually, throughout the Cold War, if I'm not mistaken, there was cooperation between the Soviets and the Americans in these areas. What role did those things have to play? How important are they?
Well, they're very important. I mean, I'll give you a good example. It starts with my grandfather's Atoms for Peace, I should say, President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace project. And among the takeaways from that, not only were we going to cooperate with the Soviet Union around some parts of nuclear science, but the United States, actually, it was the initiative of the Soviet Union as part of Atoms for Peace to declassify a whole area of nuclear science. And guess what that is? It's fusion. Today, fusion is in the news all the time as being, the great hope for our unlimited energy future. And this comes out of the Atoms for Peace process. But we engaged Soviet scientists across the board during the Cold War. And guess who were the greatest proponents of democratization in the Soviet Union, and later actually voted to, in Parliament, to bring about the end of the Soviet Union, was the scientific community. They were the ones who were most westernized. They were the ones who wanted desperately to be part of the big world and that includes, as we know later, the space community in Russia. Fortunately, that cooperation is still underway, because I personally believe that there should be areas that are not closed down whenever crises of one sort or another come up, because it's not the people who have caused the problem. It's not the Russian people, as we're seeing from their protests and the number of collective letters that people I know have signed. It's not the Russian people that we're fighting. We are fighting a state regime, we being Ukraine, and it concerns, just to be official, nobody's declared war on anybody, on NATO or the United States, but the people we have a problem with are the ones who resorted to violence while we were trying to find a solution to this. And So there's a lot. It won't be time anytime soon to get this started again. The only thing that feels difficult for somebody who's been at it this long is that, it's 25, 30 years of work gone. And it'll be up to the next generation to, after we get, a lot of these issues sorted out, then we're going to have to start again. And it'll be up to another generation to do it.
Well, there's definitely a lot to build on. So that's hopefully a little bit, there's a little bit of hope, I think.
Listen, I have to say on that point, we all have to be hopeful. Mm-hmm. There are so many things that we have been asked that we never even imagined were going to happen. I mean, in the last 5 years, we've had plague, we've had war. I mean, it's crazy. And the thing is that we all have to get up every morning and tell ourselves that there are things we can do to make things better. Every day, each one of us can do that. And I think that's something else I got from my grandfather. He always used to say, you have to be for something. Don't be against something. You have to be for something. And, that is so important if you think about it. It seems so simple, but it's so hard. Let's not get up this morning and, be against everything that's going on. It's our responsibility to find even the smallest of steps to move forward.
I love that. And I'm also conscious of time and the need to probably wrap up here. So I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up. But was there anything that we didn't get a chance to cover that you wanted to mention?
Well, no, it's just that I have a wonderful group of students that I teach at Gettysburg College on strategy and leadership. It's called Strategy and Leadership in Transformational Times. When I named that seminar, I had absolutely no idea that the times were going to be as transformational as they turned out to be. But as I tell them all the time, we're counting on you. So please dive into these subjects, learn about them, learn about the history, because what's unfolding in the former Soviet space all has its roots from long ago, 30 years ago, a whole generation. And we have to remember that President Putin has been in prominent positions for that entire 30 years. He hasn't forgotten. So it's up to us to understand what we should not forget ourselves, what we stand for, what our values are, what we want to be for, and then find ways to bring others along in a positive, proactive way. It doesn't take staging wars or military interventions to make the world a better place. As a matter of fact, one person at a time, one project at a time, one movement at a time, I've seen it myself, has changed the world.
Fabulous. This was wonderful. I could keep talking to you, but I will let you go and get on with your day. But thank you ever so much for coming onto the show and speaking to all of our listeners.
Well, good. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity so much.
Thank you. All right. I hope you found that insightful. And if you make decisions and are in a leadership role of any kind, I highly recommend you pick up a copy of Susan Eisenhower's book, How Ike Led. And if you enjoyed the episode, you can do us a great favor right now by sharing it with someone you know will also enjoy it. That is it for now. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.